What kind of world do we imagine when we say the word civilization? We picture stone temples glowing at sunrise, cities arranged with mathematical grace, bronze tools, painted walls, prayers rising into the air. We think of order, of progress, of human beings learning, building, remembering. But every civilization also carried another story close to its chest, a quieter story written not in triumph, but in fear, ritual, and survival. The ancient world was not only a place of invention, it was a place of bargaining, with gods, with nature, with death itself. A failed harvest, a changing river, an eclipse, a plague, a war at the border, any of these could shake a society to its foundations. And when the ground beneath human certainty began to move, people reached for meaning in the only ways they knew. Sometimes that meaning took the shape of beauty. Sometimes it took the shape of cruelty. What unsettles us is not simply what they did. It is how carefully they did it. The precision of a burial, the architecture of a sacrifice, the rules repeated across generations until ritual began to feel like law, and law began to feel like destiny. In these moments, the past stops looking distant. It becomes intimate, familiar even, because beneath every ceremony was the same question that follows us now. What must be given up so that life can continue? This journey is not about judging the dead from the comfort of the present. It is about standing beside them long enough to feel the weight of their uncertainty, to see how intelligence and violence, reverence and terror often lived in the same house. We call these people ancient, but their longings were recognizably human. So before we enter their cities, their temples, and their burial grounds, hold one thought in mind. History is rarely divided between wisdom and barbarity. More often, it is a mirror held in low light, showing us not monsters, but ourselves, shaped by different gods, different fears, and the same fragile desire to endure. What if the first great machine of the ancient world was built not for the living, but for the dead? South of Cairo, where the desert keeps its own council, the sand once opened over a place that changed how we think about ancient Egypt. Not a royal chamber filled with gold, not a single tomb wrapped in mystery, a workshop, tables, jars, traces of resin and salt. The quiet evidence of labor, repeated so often, it became almost ordinary. Death prepared with skill, eternity assembled by hand. For generations, we were taught to imagine mummification as a rare privilege, a sacred act reserved for kings and the wealthy few. But the reality appears more human, and in some ways more unsettling. Preservation was not only an act of devotion, it was a system. Materials were measured, bodies were cleaned, dried, packed, sealed. Some received elaborate care, others humbler versions of the same promise. In this landscape, even poverty did not erase the hope that the body might still matter after breath was gone. There is something haunting in that precision. The brain removed because it was not believed to hold the self. The heart left in place, trusted as the center of memory, judgment, and feeling. The body dried for weeks under strict timing, then wrapped layer by layer, as if each fold of linen might hold chaos back a little longer. Across centuries, the method barely changed. Not because people lacked imagination, but because ritual had become a kind of certainty in a world that offered very little. Maybe that is what makes it feel so modern. Faced with death, human beings still search for process, for order, for one last thing that can be done correctly. The Egyptians looked at mortality and answered with craft, discipline, and reverence. But beneath all that care lingers a more intimate question. Were they preserving the dead for eternity or protecting the living from the terror of being forgotten? What happens when even grief is told to keep its distance? Imagine a hill above an ancient city at first light. The wind moves over bare stone. Families climb in silence, carrying the body of someone they loved. Not toward a grave, not toward a pyre, but toward an open, circular tower exposed to the sky. There, beneath the sun and in full view of the horizon, the dead are laid down for birds to complete what time will eventually finish. To many outsiders, the practice seems severe. But for Zoroastrian communities in ancient Persia and later beyond, this was not neglect. It was reverence shaped by a different understanding of purity. Earth was sacred. Fire was sacred. A corpse, once life had departed, was thought to carry contamination that should touch neither soil nor flame. So a careful alternative emerged: stone towers raised above the living world, where the body could return through air and light without defiling the elements that sustained life. The design itself feels almost mathematical, rings arranged with order, men in one circle, women in another, children at the center, flesh removed swiftly by vultures, bones left to whiten in the sun, then gathered into a central well. Nothing hidden, nothing sentimental. Death was not softened. It was acknowledged with a kind of austere honesty. And yet there is something deeply moving in that starkness. These towers ask the living to witness what most cultures try to conceal. They offer no illusion that the body can be preserved forever. No sealed tomb, no promise of permanence through stone. Only the acceptance that life borrows matter and must one day return it. Perhaps that is what makes this tradition feel so unsettling to us. It strips away our usual comforts and leaves only the essential question. When someone we love is gone, what exactly are we trying to protect? The body they inhabited, or the meaning they left behind? What kind of city asks its children to begin life inside a wall of fear? In ancient Sparta, mourning did not belong to softness. It belonged to discipline, to inspection, to the steady removal of everything considered weak. The ideal was spoken of with admiration by later generations, but lived reality was narrower, colder, and far less forgiving. This was not simply a warrior culture. It was a society built on the belief that survival required the constant shaping of human beings into instruments. Boys were taken young and folded into the agoge, the state-run system that trained them not merely to fight, but to endure hunger, pain, humiliation, and silence. They learned to move in step, speak briefly, obey without hesitation. Hardship was not an unfortunate part of the process. It was the process. To suffer was to be refined. To complain was to fail. Even cleverness was prized mainly when it served toughness, as though the mind itself existed to sharpen the body. Yet Sparta's discipline was never only about courage. Beneath the polished legend stood a permanent anxiety. The city relied on a vast population of helots, people forced into labor and kept under threat. Spartan strength, so often celebrated, lived beside constant fear of revolt. That fear seeped into daily life, into training, into the state's obsession with vigilance. A society that glorified mastery was, in many ways, imprisoned by the need to maintain it. That is the paradox history leaves us. We admire resilience. We respect endurance. But there is a line where discipline ceases to strengthen a people and begins to hollow them out. Sparta's memory has survived because it offers a powerful image of collective will. It also leaves behind a quieter warning. When a civilization teaches that mercy is weakness and struggle is virtue, what kind of inner life can still survive there? And what is lost when strength becomes the only language a culture trusts? What if the grandest cities in the ancient world were also the easiest places to disappear? In Rome, spectacle was a form of governance. Marble temples rose above crowded streets. Aqueducts carried water across impossible distances. Laws were written, roads measured, armies disciplined. To later generations, it can look like the moment civilization learned to stand upright and call itself eternal. But beneath that confidence moved a harsher rhythm, one carried by the labor of the poor, the enslaved, the conquered, and the expendable. To live in Rome without status was to exist close to danger. Buildings leaned over narrow lanes like tired giants. Fires could race through whole districts in a night. Disease moved easily in crowded tenements where sewage, animals, and people often shared the same fragile geography. Bread might be plentiful one season and scarce the next. Public entertainment offered release, but it also revealed something essential about the Roman mind. Violence was not always hidden. Often, it was arranged, applauded, and given a schedule. The arena remains the clearest symbol of that contradiction. We remember the scale, the engineering, the roar of the crowd, but at its center was a cultural lesson. Death could be transformed into performance. Suffering could be wrapped in ritual and named honor, justice, punishment, or amusement, depending on who was watching. The empire was brilliant at turning power into theater and theater into obedience. And yet Rome was not simply cruel. It was also literate, inventive, administratively gifted, and legally ambitious. That is what makes it linger in the imagination. It held refinement and brutality in the same hand. The same civilization that built libraries and baths could normalize conquest and public bloodshed without seeing contradiction. Perhaps that is why Rome still feels close to us. Not because we live as they did, but because we understand the temptation to dress domination in beauty. A civilization may call itself advanced, but the real question is quieter. Advanced for whom? Safe for whom? Remembered by whom? What if survival depended on pleasing forces you could never fully understand? In the cities of the ancient Maya, the sky was not scenery. It was a text, alive with warnings, patterns, and sacred timing. Priests read the heavens like a language of obligation. Kings stood as intermediaries between the human world and powers thought to govern rain, maize, fertility, and war. Temples rose above the forest not just as monuments, but as instruments aligned with cycles larger than any single life. To live there was to inhabit a cosmos dense with meaning, but also with pressure. The beauty of Maya civilization still astonishes us. Their calendars tracked celestial movements with extraordinary precision. Their architects shaped stone into observatories, plazas, and pyramids that caught light in deliberate ways. Their scribes recorded dynasties, rituals, and moments of political theater with remarkable sophistication. Yet beneath that brilliance ran a harder truth. When crops failed, when drought deepened, when war unsettled the land, meaning itself could become a burden. If the universe was ordered, then disorder demanded a response. That response often took ritual form. Bloodletting was not a symbol, but a physical offering, a way for rulers and nobles to prove devotion through pain. In some contexts, human sacrifice entered that same framework, not as senseless violence, but as an act believed to sustain balance between worlds. To modern eyes, it is difficult not to recoil. And yet history asks us to look beyond recoil. These acts emerged from a civilization trying to negotiate uncertainty with the only tools it trusted: ceremony, mathematics, lineage, and belief. The haunting part is not simply the violence, it is the sincerity, the conviction that suffering, carefully arranged, might help keep the universe in motion. We may reject that logic, but we still understand the impulse beneath it. When life becomes fragile, people search for patterns strong enough to hold fear. And so the Maya leave us with a question as vast as their sky. When the world feels unstable, what stories do we create to persuade ourselves that order can still be restored? What if the ground beneath your feet was both your greatest gift and your constant threat? Between the Tigris and Euphrates, where mud could become brick and rivers could become roads, some of the earliest cities on Earth began to rise. In Mesopotamia, people learned how to channel water, measure land, record debts, and turn surplus into power. It was an extraordinary human achievement, the kind that changes history so completely we almost stop noticing how precarious it was. Because the same rivers that fed the fields could also erase them. Life in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria depended on forces no one could fully control. Floods arrived without mercy. Droughts settled in slowly and stayed too long. Salts built up in irrigated soil, quietly reducing what the land could give back. City walls protected against enemies, but not against ecological exhaustion. And over all of it hung the reality of war, because fertile ground in a difficult world rarely stays unclaimed for long. The kings of Mesopotamia answered instability with administration and myth. They inscribed laws into stone. They raised ziggurats toward the heavens. They catalogued grain, labor, tribute, and omen after omen, as if naming uncertainty might reduce it. Religion, government, and survival were tightly braided together. If disaster struck, it was not merely practical failure. It could feel like cosmic disapproval, a sign that the relationship between human order and divine order had been broken. There is something deeply familiar in that response. Faced with fragile systems, people build records, institutions, and stories sturdy enough to outlast the next crisis. But Mesopotamia reminds us that complexity is never the same as security. A civilization can invent writing and still tremble at the riverbank. It can map the stars and still lose its harvest to salt and sun. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson left in those shattered tablets and ruined walls. Human beings are astonishing builders, but we have always built inside conditions we do not command. And the question that haunted Mesopotamia still follows us now, when our greatest achievements depend on a balance we cannot fully keep. What does it really mean to call a society stable? What if the sea that made your world possible could also swallow it without warning? The Minoans of ancient Crete are often remembered through fragments of elegance, frescoes filled with motion, palaces arranged around open courts, pottery shaped with a confidence that suggests daily life was touched by beauty. For a long time, they have stood in the imagination as a civilization of color, trade, and relative openness, a people turned toward the sea rather than locked behind walls. But island life has its own vulnerability. The horizon can bring wealth, and it can bring ruin. To live in the Bronze Age Aegean was to depend on delicate systems. Ships carried food, metals, timber, and ideas from port to port. Prosperity moved on water. So did danger. Storms, piracy, earthquakes, crop uncertainty, and shifting alliances all pressed against the edges of Minoan life. And then there was the deeper force beneath it all, geological and indifferent. The volcanic eruption on Thera, one of the most powerful natural events of the ancient world, did not simply darken the sky. It may have sent shockwaves through trade, agriculture, climate, and confidence itself. Even now, the exact scale of the disaster is debated. That uncertainty matters. History is often less a clean verdict than a field of traces. What we know is that societies built on exchange can be wounded by interruptions far beyond their control. A harbor silts up, a route closes, an earthquake cracks storage rooms and shrines. A generation grows up after catastrophe, inheriting the architecture of a world whose balance has already shifted. That is what gives the Minoan story its quiet sadness. Their civilization seems to shimmer at the edge of disappearance, not because it lacked intelligence or artistry, but because grace offers no immunity from chaos. We tend to think beauty is evidence of safety. Ancient Crete suggests otherwise. A culture can be sophisticated, joyful, and deeply alive, and still remain vulnerable to the sudden changes of earth and sea. Perhaps that is why their ruins still feel so moving. They remind us that fragility is not the opposite of greatness. Sometimes it is woven into greatness from the beginning. And the question their broken palaces leave behind is one we still struggle to answer. How do we build lives of meaning in a world that can change faster than memory? What if the people history remembers for wisdom were also trapped inside a system that demanded suffering to function? Classical Athens is often introduced like a bright beginning. We picture sunlight on marble, open debate in the agora, philosophers asking questions that still shape the modern mind. Democracy, theater, geometry, rhetoric, civic identity, so much of what later cultures celebrate seems to gather there. But the glow of Athens becomes more complicated when we step closer. Beneath its ideals stood exclusions so ordinary to the people who lived them that they could pass almost without notice. Citizenship was narrow. Women, enslaved people, foreigners, and laborers who supported the city's rhythm often stood outside the freedoms now associated with Athenian life. Public speech was prized, but not every voice could enter the conversation. Philosophy reached toward universal questions, yet daily life remained structured by class, gender, and coercion. The city that taught the world to ask what justice means did not distribute justice evenly among its own people. And then there was plague and war. During the Peloponnesian conflict, Athens discovered how fragile its confidence could be. Crowded behind its walls, the city endured disease, fear, political instability, and moral exhaustion. The same culture that produced tragedy on the stage lived through tragedy in its streets. Greatness did not shield it from panic. Intelligence did not prevent cruelty. In moments of pressure, democratic ideals could harden into suspicion, vengeance, and reckless pride. That contradiction may be the most revealing part of Athens. It was not a false civilization. Its achievements were real. Its art, philosophy, and experiments in self-government changed the course of history. But its brilliance came wrapped in the limitations of its age, and in some ways of every age. Human beings are capable of imagining noble principles while still failing to live by them fully. Perhaps that is why Athens continues to matter. Not because it perfected freedom, but because it exposed how difficult freedom truly is. It asks us to consider whether a society should be measured by the ideals it declares or by the lives of those left outside the frame. And in that gap between aspiration and reality, we may recognize something uncomfortably familiar. What if the most disciplined empire in the ancient Andes survived by teaching entire communities to live at the mercy of altitude, labor, and obedience? High in the spine of South America, the Inca built an empire that still feels improbable. Roads crossed mountains that seem almost designed to refuse human passage. Stone walls were fitted so precisely they appear less constructed than persuaded into place. Terraces climbed steep valleys, turning difficult land into food, stability, and statecraft. From a distance, it can look like a triumph of harmony between human will and an unforgiving landscape. Up close, it was also a world of extraordinary demands. Life in the Inca realm was governed by reciprocity, but also by control. Families owed labor to the state through the mita system, working fields, roads, temples, storehouses, and military infrastructure as part of an immense collective machine. This labor sustained the empire, redistributed resources, and allowed administrators to respond to famine and scarcity with impressive coordination. Yet it also meant that survival was deeply tied to service. The state could nourish, organize, and protect, but it could also absorb the body and time of nearly everyone beneath it. The environment itself added another layer of difficulty. Thin air, long distances, steep terrain, and fragile harvest cycles shaped daily existence. To endure there required intelligence, adaptation, and communal discipline. But even in such a practical society, belief remained central. Mountains were not simply rocks, they were sacred presences. Ancestors were not entirely gone. They remained woven into political memory. In some rituals, especially those linked to crisis or sacred obligation, children could be offered in capicocha ceremonies, placed with astonishing care on high summits as emissaries to the divine world. That is the part that lingers. The tenderness of the preparation, the severity of the act. A civilization so capable of engineering life from difficult land could still imagine that innocence might be the purest gift to powers beyond human reach. And perhaps that is the deeper unease the Inca leave us with. When a society becomes remarkably good at organization and sacrifice, how easily can devotion to the whole begin to ask too much of the individual? What if a civilization could be extraordinarily advanced and still leave us with almost no clear explanation of how it held itself together? The Indus Valley world arrives through silence. Its cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, and others, were laid out with a calm intelligence that still feels startling. Streets met in careful grids. Drains ran beneath neighborhoods with a sophistication many later societies would struggle to match. Standardized bricks appeared across vast distances, suggesting coordination, planning, and shared habits of thought. And yet the people behind this order remain strangely difficult to hear. Their script still resists full translation. Their rulers, if they ruled in ways we recognize, do not announce themselves in grand monuments. Power seems present, but muted. That quiet has invited wonder. Here was an urban civilization with technical skill, far-reaching trade, and a remarkable concern for infrastructure, sanitation, and consistency. But life there was almost certainly harder than the neat ruins first suggest. Rivers shifted course, floods arrived, water management had to be maintained with constant care. Heat, disease, crop uncertainty, and the slow pressures of ecological change were never far away. Even in a society that appears unusually ordered, daily existence would have rested on fragile balances between labor, season, and supply. What makes the Indus story so haunting is precisely what it does not dramatize. We do not see vast royal tombs proclaiming triumph over death. We do not find giant war scenes carved in stone. Instead, we meet a civilization through bricks, weights, drains, wells, beads, and seals, through evidence of ordinary systems that only function when many people keep doing the difficult, repetitive work of maintaining them. It reminds us that endurance is often less theatrical than conquest, and perhaps more admirable for that reason. And then, over time, the pattern changed. Cities thinned, networks loosened. The old urban coherence faded into something more dispersed. Not a single dramatic ending, but a long unraveling whose exact causes remain debated. That uncertainty is part of the lesson. Civilizations do not always collapse with a roar. Sometimes they recede like water from a shoreline, leaving behind the outline of a world that once worked. And the question the Indus leaves with us is quietly profound. How many of the systems we depend on every day feel permanent only because, for the moment, they still function? What if the civilization that mastered time itself still could not escape the burden of feeding power with blood? Among the Mexica, whom history often calls the Aztecs, the world was understood as fragile motion. Dawn was not guaranteed. Seasons were not automatic. The sun itself seemed to require continuation, as though the universe survived through effort, offering, and memory. In Tenochtitlan, a city rising from the waters with astonishing order and ambition, that belief took architectural form. Causeways stretched across the lake. Markets moved with disciplined energy. Temples climbed into the sky. It was one of the great urban achievements of its age, brilliant, organized, and alive with sacred meaning. But within that radiance was a sharper edge. Warfare was tied not only to territory and prestige, but to ritual necessity. Captives could become offerings. Ceremonies unfolded with a precision that fused religion, politics, and theater into one overwhelming display. To modern eyes, the scale of sacrificial practices is difficult to confront. Yet to leave the story there would be too simple. These rituals did not emerge from madness. They emerged from a worldview in which cosmic balance was thought to depend on reciprocal exchange. If the gods had given their own force to create the world, then human beings owed something back. That logic is unsettling because it is internally coherent. It turns fear into duty and duty into public ceremony. The temple becomes both staircase and statement, a place where devotion is made visible, where the state demonstrates its intimacy with the sacred, and where private mortality is drawn into a larger cosmic script. Beneath all of it lies a deeply human impulse to believe that catastrophe can be postponed if the right sacrifice is made at the right time. And perhaps that is why the Aztec world continues to haunt the imagination, not because it was uniquely violent, but because it reveals how sophistication and severity can coexist without contradiction inside a single system of meaning. Tenochtitlan was a city of engineering, agriculture, poetry, trade, and disciplined governance. It was also a place where people believed the future might depend on rituals that demanded unbearable offerings. The question it leaves us with is not only how such a society endured, but why human beings so often convince themselves that survival requires someone, somewhere, to pay the highest price. What if the people who seemed closest to the gods were also the ones most trapped by the demands of the divine? In ancient Carthage, the sea was both highway and destiny. Ships left its harbors carrying purple dye, metals, timber, grain, and stories from one shore to another. This was a civilization of merchants, navigators, and diplomats, skilled at turning geography into influence. From a distance, Carthage appears worldly and disciplined, a maritime power held together by trade, strategy, and practical intelligence. Yet beneath that outward confidence lies one of history's most troubling debates: how fear, devotion, and survival may have converged in the sacred life of the city. Archaeologists and historians still argue over the meaning of the Tophet, the burial ground associated with urns containing the cremated remains of infants and young children, often marked with inscriptions to deities such as Tanit and Baal-Hamon. Some interpret these sites as evidence of ritual sacrifice carried out in moments of crisis or vow. Others urge caution, suggesting that at least some of the dead may have been children who died naturally and were buried within a sacred framework that later observers misunderstood or exaggerated. The uncertainty matters. It reminds us that the ancient world often reaches us through hostile witnesses, fragmentary evidence, and meanings half lost in translation. And yet even uncertainty can carry its own kind of weight. If the rituals were sacrificial, they suggest a civilization confronting danger through offerings of unbearable significance. If they were not, the persistence of the accusation still reveals something about how enemies preferred to imagine Carthage: foreign, excessive, morally alien. In either case, what endures is a portrait of a society living under immense pressure, competitive, vulnerable, dependent on trade routes and divine favor in a world where either could fail without warning. That is what makes Carthage feel so human despite the distance. It was rich, strategic, and deeply connected, but also exposed. Its story reminds us that sophisticated societies do not leave behind simple moral signatures. They leave fragments, arguments, and shadows. And perhaps the question Carthage places before us is this: when history is written by both evidence and fear, how do we learn to distinguish what truly happened from what later generations needed to believe? So what remains after we walk through these vanished worlds? Not just stone, ash, bone, and script, not merely the architecture of fear or the rituals that now seem difficult to understand. What remains, more than anything, is a pattern. Again and again, human beings met uncertainty by building meaning around it. They raised temples against the sky, carved laws into rock, mapped stars, preserved bodies, disciplined children, moved mountains, and offered what they believed might keep chaos at bay. Their methods were often harsh. Their beliefs could wound as much as they comforted. But beneath those differences lies something recognizably human. The ancient civilizations we have visited were not cautionary tales in any simple sense. They were brilliant, adaptive, imaginative societies trying to survive landscapes, climates, diseases, rival empires, and the constant nearness of death. They made art in dangerous places. They found order where nature offered no guarantees. They built systems large enough to outlast generations, and sometimes so rigid that they asked too much from the people living inside them. That tension between creation and cost may be one of the oldest truths in history. It is easy to look back and see only extremity, harder and more honest to see kinship. We no longer raise ziggurats to calm the rivers or lay our dead in towers beneath circling birds, but we still search for systems that make us feel less fragile. We trust institutions, technologies, routines, and explanations. We still hope the right structure, the right sacrifice, the right certainty might hold disorder back. In that sense, the ancient world is not gone. It survives in our instincts, our anxieties, and our endless effort to make life feel durable. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Civilization has never been proof that human beings conquered fear. It is what fear, hope, memory, and intelligence created together. And if history offers any wisdom, it may be this. The measure of a society is not only what it builds to endure, but what it asks people to surrender in return. The past does not hand us simple judgments. It offers a quieter invitation to become more careful with power, more humble before uncertainty, and more tender with one another while our own brief civilizations are still here.